Hey, what's up? My name is Addie, and in today's tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to paint these ink and watercolor pears in Procreate. We're going to be painting them from a couple different angles, as well as some varied slices. You can apply these techniques to paint other types of fruits and veggies in this style. I think it would make a super cool print series or would work well as a personal art challenge. So a few months ago, I released a massive update for my ink and watercolor brush set, but I did it kind of quietly. So I didn't make new content showing how to use the brushes that were included in the update, but I wanted to do that today. I'm going to be showing you some ways to use the newly added brushes throughout the project so that you can see how they behave and interact with each other. If you would like to check the whole set out, the brushes are linked in the description below. And if you want to try a free sample from the brush pack, you can sign up for my newsletter by clicking the link up here. That will give you access to the sample along with tons of other free brushes, paper textures, and color palettes. If you'd prefer, you can absolutely follow along with any watercolor brushes that you have. All right, let's get into it. To start off, I have my pears color palette loaded in here. That is linked in the description if you want to download that for free. I'm going to be working in the paper texture canvas that comes with the set. Right now I'm using paper 2 and splatter option 3. Now when it comes to painting watercolor digitally, a paper texture really makes all the difference. And so whether you're using this one that comes with the set or a different one, that is one of my biggest recommendations. And then I have duplicated the painting layer. The textures should all sit above the painting layers so that the texture can pass through what you're painting below. I've duplicated the painting layers a few times. I'm probably going to do one more, so I have 4 painting layers. And on our first layer, we are going to jump in, snagging this off black color from the color palette. I'm also going to pop out my color palette so I can just pick colors from here. We're going to start drawing these pears in a sketchy style using the fine tip liner. This is a new brush and it's meant to imitate those 0.5 millimeter micron pens. We're going to be drawing several pears on this page in an arrangement. So keeping the composition in mind, I'm zooming in here to the upper left corner. Don't stress about positioning things perfectly right now because we can always use the transform tool to move and rotate them later. Now, pears are fun because they're like a little bit wonky and lumpy. I find them to be a very forgiving shape to draw. Even so, you might still want to use a reference. I do, so I'm going to pull up Pinterest in side-by-side mode. I like doing this for more loose references where I want to see a lot of examples of something at once, so that's why I'm using this and not Procreate's built-in reference image tool for this. So I am sketching in a more bulbous round shape on the bottom and then narrowing it for the top third. And you can see I am being super messy and I like this little blocky style. This is just one way that you can do it. I'm going to erase with the felt tip inker and make some of these a little less thick. I don't quite like having that heavy line weight of a bunch of sketchy lines. And then I'm going to do a little half circle here at the top where the stem comes, and then we'll just draw a rough little stem shape. And then I'm going to attach this leaf here. All right, now our first pear is done. For the second pear, let's move to the lower right side and position it so that it is lying on its side. On this one, we're going to do that little cleft for the bottom. And I'm kind of running out of space, so I'm going to grab my selection tool and move this shape over. I have it set to freehand. I have color fill turned off. I'm just going to draw a closed circle around this unfinished pear, and then I'm going to grab the transform tool and just slide this over a bit. Now I am continuing to sketch out this shape, narrowing it towards the top. Same as before, I'm going to add a curved stem here. I'm going over these lines again to thicken them so that it matches the other pear. And I'm switching to the eraser to clean up the insides of these lines a bit. Now I'm going to square off some of the curves here to make it more stylistically consistent to the first pear. If you really want to lean into this sketchy style, I find that it can help to extend these straight lines beyond the shape of the pear, crossing over each other, kind of like intersections. Now my line work feels a little too thick, so I'm going back in with the eraser on the inside to thin the lines out a bit. Next, we can move on to the third pear. So I'm moving down to this empty area of the canvas. All right, so we're gonna draw a cut pear, but I kind of want to draw it on an angle like this. But I'm going to show you a cool way to kind of get that perspective, even if you aren't sure how to achieve that kind of visual. I'm starting by drawing the rough shape of just the cut plane of the pear. So that's the part that's just the white flesh, as if it were viewed straight on, kind of like this reference image up here on the Pinterest side. I'm going to erase some of these contour lines because these are meant to help us illustrate the volume of the bulge of the base of the pear. And since this is a slice, it's cut in half, it's flat on the surface. So I want to be sure that that's clean in the inside. Now switching back to the pen, I'm going to sketch a line down the center to indicate the core of the pear, but I'm leaving a gap here in the middle where the seeds are going to go. And then for the seeds, these are little teardrop shapes. Now we can change the perspective. So just like when I moved this pear, I am going to use the freehand selection tool. I'm going to draw all the way around it. I'm also going to increase the size. So we'll do that first. I'm switching to the transform tool once I have my selection drawn. Set to uniform for now. We're going to increase the size. That maintains proportion. And then, let's see, I'm going to rotate this a little bit. And then we're going to switch to distort, and grabbing one of the corner nodes, we can start to adjust the perspective a bit. And what I want to do is shear this, and we'll draw in the side where you can see like the peel and stuff. And you might see that after skewing and increasing the size, the brush strokes aren't quite as crisp as these other ones. No worries about that. We can just clean up this a little bit with the eraser. You could redraw over it, but I'm just not that concerned about this. So I'm going to remove some of the line work because we're going to go back in, and I just don't want it to get super heavy. So removing just a little bit of the line work, switching back to the brush, and then I'm going over some of those places that I erased, as well as adding some additional lines in places that I didn't erase. And then starting from not quite the very center of the top of the pear, I don't know if this phrasing makes sense for what I'm trying to demonstrate here, but I would say this connects at 0 at the top and then gets a little wider, a little further away from our cut edge, and then connects back at 0 at the bottom. And so that just helps show bulk. Okay, so looking at my composition here, we're going to draw a couple more angles of pears, but first I'm going to flip this using the freehand selection tool, switching to the transform. Then I'm going to tap flip vertical, And I'm rotating that a little bit. I just think it's more interesting having this at the different angle, maybe spaced out a bit. I'm going to switch to uniform and decrease the size just a little bit because I want these all to be around the same size pear. Okay, so now we are going to draw a slice of a pear. I'm gonna go ahead and close this Pinterest so that I have the full screen. And here we're gonna start with the long, straight cut edge. Since I'm envisioning this as a cut wedge of pear, I'm then gonna draw a curve to create the outside edge. So this here is the flat cut plane of the wedge. Then, similar to the last one we drew, we're gonna create the volume of this shape here, connecting first from the lower tip, then following the curve of the base here, and then tapering back in to connect to 0 towards the top. And then we are going to tidy that up, again, just using the eraser on the felt tip inker. Drawing in the seed here. Now it's ended up being kind of squished in here, so I'm going to move this with the selection tool. Then using transform to drag it and rotate it a bit. I also am going to make the line work a little more angular, as I had forgotten to when I was sketching this. And then I'm beefing it up as I go over these lines. Finally, this little edge here on the bottom needs some cleaning up, so I'm going to angle it inward a bit and then neaten up these lines. Next, we are going to draw a cross section. For this, we're kind of drawing a decagon, though you definitely don't need to worry about it having exactly 10 sides, but we're just trying to get that more angular look. Now I'm going to estimate the center point and put a small dot here. Then zooming in, we can add in the seeds, kind of close to the center dot. Drawing these rough diamond shapes. I'm trying to space them relatively evenly to create a starburst. Then I'm beefing up the outside line work again to match the rest of the pears. All right, for my last line work step here, we're just going to draw a couple leaves. I'm going to throw one here and one here. So I'll start here. I'm going to draw this leaf as bent, so I'm starting first with a curved line, and then a second curved line that crosses over the first, but still connects at the start and end points, then a third line down the center. Then I'm connecting the first and second lines here at the bend, fixing this furthest edge of the leaf down here, and then cleaning it up with the eraser. If you haven't seen my leaf drawing video, you can check that up in the cards here. I'll show you how you can draw like twisted and curved leaves that have this nice flow to them using that 3-line technique. This I am going to turn upside down and increase the size just a little bit. And I want to erase this center line after all. Now for the second leaf, this is going to be a little less dimensional, so first I'm roughing in the shape of this, adding the stem, and then up here I'm going to add a little curved bit on the top. You'll see I'm being pretty messy with my line work here. That is just the aesthetic I'm going for. If you want to do something cleaned up with this, I think that would be pretty cool too. Or maybe something that's like a little more watery ink, because that's not quite the style that we're going for. Now, lastly, my whole composition, it's all on this one singular layer, and it's not centered. I have way more margin here and here than I do here and here. So I'm going to just grab the transform tool, and that will select everything that's on the layer and just reposition this. If you want to get it perfectly centered, you can turn on magnetics and snapping and align your selection with until these 2 gold lines snap in. However, that is just aligning every single edge of every mark to the center, and for me, I just like to eyeball it. All right, next we can move on to watercolor. So for the watercolor, we're going to move to the layer directly below. I've just renamed this. And we're going to start with the mid-texture watercolor no edge version. So the diluted and no edge versions are iterations of the mid-texture watercolor. The mid-texture watercolor, I will demonstrate for you, is a pretty blendable paintbrush. However, it does add this hard, darker edge when you layer it on top, even as it blends what's underneath your newest stroke. The difference is with the mid-texture diluted, this just has less pigment and then a slightly less harsh edge, which allows you to blend it out. But it does still have that layered edge. But again, this is like there's more water on the brush and a little less pigment. And so it kind of like runs out of pigment after you continue the stroke. And then the no edge brush, which is the one we'll be using for the next step, just doesn't have that dark outer edge. It does when I add more pigment. You can see, if I press really light here and then once more on top, of course it's going to have that edge from me just adding more pigment through pressure, but you can also vary your pressure and blend this out super easily. So this is a true like blend and paint brush, and it has slight color variation in each brush stroke. You can turn that off should you want to. You can tap to enter the brush studio, go into color dynamics, and turn all of these sliders that have been adjusted to 0. And then anytime that you'd like to bring it back, you can just reset the brush. And then with my brush size set to 26%, I've selected this mid mossy green color, and we're gonna start filling this. And so the nice thing about this is that it's super easy to build up some color, just using some multiple brush strokes, and then use light pressure as you paint to blend this out. And every time you start a new stroke, you're going to have a little more pigment there. And so if you want to stay in that more watery phase, I would suggest continuing the stroke or starting super small and keeping your pressure super light, and you'll immediately get back to that more watery phase. And then if you press hard, you can then get more pigment. And so I'm going to leave some white here. And then I actually should have left a little bit of white here as well. So I'm just going to erase that. And then I'll grab the paintbrush again and blend that with the paintbrush as I add a little more pigment around the edge there. Now, if you go back in, you can only really layer up the pigment to a certain point. And so for this brush, this is really good for like what would be your first coat of watercolor, and you'd then wait for it to dry if you were painting on paper. Let's see, I'm gonna switch to this gold color and paint just the peel here. And sometimes the color variation I find is maybe not quite what I want. Because I've left it on, my workaround for that would just be to undo the stroke after I see that it's not the color that I want, and redo it, and then kind of blend those colors together. Moving on to this slice, I'm going to stay with this yellow, and I'm just doing small but pigmented strokes along this outside edge, because we really would see very little of the pear peel. All right, now I'm going to move to this lighter yellowy orange. I'm going to increase my brush size a bit to fill in this second pear, and you can see I undid the brush stroke when I saw that that color wasn't quite what I wanted. I'm going to build up more color here on this bottom edge. And so you can see the paint, it kind of like sits on top. That's because there's no pass-through functionality with these colors. All right, we are going to add more depth and color with another brush, but for now, we'll just leave it at this for our base color. I'm going to switch to this brighter green. It's just slightly more brighter than the green that we used on this pear over here, and fill in our pear half. And then I'm going to grab this brighter green for these leaves. And so here's where you can see I'm using the darker edge and then blending it out to create a shadow. And then I don't want this edge to be super dark, so I'm going to decrease my brush size. I don't want this side of the leaf where it twists to be as dark. I want there to be a pretty sharp contrast between this color and what I paint here. So I've decreased my brush size, which will allow me to just start slow at the tip, and then without lifting my brush, I'm able to use light pressure to get the more watery effect of this brush. Moving on to the second leaf, I'm switching to this lighter foresty green. Starting on this twisted side, I'm using light pressure to apply less pigment here and really blending it out for a soft look. Then on the other side of the leaf, I'm layering in brush strokes to build up pigment and then blending them all together with the brush. Next, I'm switching to this darker green to fill in the leaf attached to the pear. I'm using relatively light pressure here as well because I'm also going to use this brighter green for some nice color variation. And while we're here, let's add some brighter green down on this leaf as well. You can see I'm not being super precious about staying inside the lines either. Now I'm going to grab this brown and quick fill in the stems. And then I'm going to fill in the meat of the pears. I'm going to start with this cream color. Increasing my brush size a bit here, I like to generally do this in one continuous stroke as I'm not trying to build up a ton of pigment. Instead, I'm relying primarily on brush pressure to vary the amount of color. I'm also leaving some white gaps as highlights. Switching now to this darker cream color, I'm adding this to the center of the pear core and then blending it out as I paint to soften the edges. Then I'm selecting this brown again, decreasing my brush size, and filling in these seeds. Now we can add some more color variation. So some green pears have like a red modeling to them. And what I'm trying to do here is create kind of like a bloom effect. So I'm going to layer some strokes and then increase my brush size as I paint while decreasing the brush pressure to blend out and soften that outer edge. And this is to kind of help create a nice wet on wet look. So start small and then light pressure while increasing the brush size. Now, if you'd like to just smudge it out, you can do that too. There might be places, like I have some edges here that I want to smudge a bit. So I'm going to grab the smudge brush. I have it on the zhuzh with water. This is more of a softening smudger. And so it doesn't like push the pigment quite as much. It doesn't pull it in a long distance, but it's like adding water. And so this is nice for really enhancing that bloom effect and making it look a little less like maybe chickenpox. And now moving down to this yellow pear, I'm adding some splotches on the side here. All right, so now I'm gonna do some quick layer reorganization. I'm going to drag this painting layer below my two empty painting layers. On this next layer, we're gonna use a harder edge brush to layer some pigment and build up a little bit of shadow on these pears. Grabbing the diluted glaze brush and setting the size to about 25. I'm gonna use a continuous stroke. I'm trying to keep my pressure steady. We're gonna layer in a shadow here. Do a little bit of a shadow up above this bulge. Now this one you can see it doesn't blend what's underneath it. So I still have my layered edge here. And moving up to my slice, add a little bit of depth here. And then I'm going to grab this mossy green and layer some of this. And so you can see this gives that effect of it having dried in between. I am going to smudge some of these brush strokes. I think it looks a little more natural that way. And so grabbing the zhuzh with water brush, I have this size set to 11, and I'm softening just some of the hard edges and more pigmented areas, but not all. You do want, I find it's nice to retain some of those. Now with the glaze brush, it's just a less watery version. And selecting this bright green, I'm going to use this to really emphasize some of the shadows on these leaves. And then grabbing this same mossy green that we used on this pear, decreasing my brush size, I'm painting in a faint shadow here. Now we get to do the real fun embellishments. So on this last empty painting layer, I'm going to set the blend mode to multiply, and then I'm going to duplicate this. One of the big additions with the update to this brush set was that I added a lot more watercolor stamp and texture brushes and droplets to enhance the watercolor texture effect. So I'm going to grab some splotches. And these you kind of just want to play around with. So I like to stamp once in the middle and then maybe adjust the size and stamp again. And then grab the transform tool. You can play around with the positioning of this. We're going to trim away the excess so that won't be an issue. Sometimes it can help to use the warp tool to adjust the splotch as well. So I'm stretching it a bit here and using it to add both depth and texture along the side of this pear. So I can tap the transform tool to release, and then I'm going to grab the select tool, set to freehand. Zooming in, we're going to draw a selection to remove the rest of the splotch that is not on the pear. So the selection is going to follow the outline of the pear along this edge. I'm actually tapping between each point to create the selection, so each place that I tap will connect to the last with a straight line. Then we're going to draw all the way around the outside of this splotch and connect back up at the top to close the selection. Since the splotch is on its own layer, we don't have to worry about drawing over other things on the canvas. Then I'm switching to the transform tool, set to anything that's not warp, and dragging it off of the canvas. And so just like that, we have some nice watercolor texture. If you want, you can play with the layer opacity as well to adjust how much it's emphasized. I'm going to work on the same layer. The thing to be cognizant of is you don't want to draw your next splotch directly on top of this. And so I'm going to grab watercolor splotch 12 and switch to this yellow color. And when I'm stamping that on the screen, I'm just staying clear of this area. So then when I go to grab my selection, I'm going to draw around the shape, switch to the transform tool, and position this. So I kind of like what that's doing here. It has some of those gaps that we were talking about. So I'm going to leave that in that position, switch to the freehand select tool. And this time, after I grab what we want to cut away, I'm going to switch to the transform tool. Instead of dragging it off screen, I'm going to reuse a little bit of this. I'm going to use this edge up on this part of the pear. Then I'm going to grab the selection tool and select the part that we're not using. And this time, use the transform tool to drag that off the screen. Right, next, we're going to switch to this darker cream color, a little gray, I guess, and grabbing watercolor splotch 9. I'm going to stamp this, staying clear of this pear and this pear, which already have stamps on them. And I'm grabbing the freehand selection tool to draw a selection around the shape. Then switching to the transform tool, I'm going to play around with the placement. I specifically want this on the cream part of the pear, so I'm rotating and moving it to figure out where it looks best. I like how it looks down here on the lower half, so now I'm going to release the selection and then grabbing the freehand selection tool again. Then I'm selecting along this line, along the cream, so that the splotch doesn't overlap the peel. Then I am finishing the selection by drawing around the rest of the splotch and then closing that selection. Switching to the transform tool, I'm now going to move this over to use part of the remaining splotch on this slice. So once again, I'm playing around with the placement to figure out where I best like the positioning. Then I'm going to release that and grabbing the selection tool again, I'm going to draw a selection around the excess, taking care not to draw the selection over any of the other splotches on this layer. Now, if it's easier for you, do feel free to work on a new layer for each of these splotches. Lastly, we want to add, let's see, we're going to do splotch 8. No, we'll do splotch 6. And stamp that, once again staying away from areas that I've already put a stamp. Use freehand select to reposition this. We're just going to add this as a little shadow in the middle here, and then freehand select to remove the rest. Okay, as a finishing touch on our final painting layer set to multiply, we are going to use some splatters. So I kind of like to use all of these in different combinations in some of the colors that we used in the painting. Starting off with this mossy green, you'll see that I tend to stamp, evaluate, and then either undo to replace the splatter or continue and add more, either in the same color or in a different one. These are scattered stamps, meaning they're a bit random and unpredictable when you place them. I'm also switching between brushes as much as color. Really with this, my goal is to make it look random but still balanced, so not too much splatter in one area or another, but also a variety of sizes and different kinds of splatters. And you'll see me undo and redo quite a bit. I think just like as I'm searching for the right balance of randomness, I think the random splatter is one of my favorites from this because it just really never quite looks the same. And then a couple other ways to kind of like mess up and add some splashes and splatters. are you can use the diluted glaze brush here, like I am, just adding some tapping to add some extra droplets and some like splashes. You can also use the wet on wet splatter brush. I like to decrease the opacity for this. I have it set to 34 here, and I feel like this gives the splatters more of a flow, if that makes sense, or kind of like ties it together. This is where I like to edit it a little more. Stand back, squint your eyes, maybe take a break and then come back and look at it and figure out if the composition is as you want it. And that's the finished piece. Hey, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you'd like to check out the ink and watercolor brush set, the link for that is down below in the description. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell to get notified when I release new videos. Till next time, bye!